Sure. Yeah, okay. Senator Patterson, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So thank you very much. This is a very, very important topic because we know that the veteran population is exponentially growing because veterans are living longer. And there are some estimates that there's over 600,000 people who are veterans, so almost the size of Ottawa from a population base spread across the country, spread across the world. So the work that you're doing is absolutely critical, and partly because we know that symptoms of PTSD may be completely ignored and not manifest until later on in their lives when it becomes untenable. I'm very impressed with the work that's been done by the Canadian Psychiatric Association in terms of guidelines on PTSD, occupational and operational stress injuries. So I have a couple of questions related to that. Because things such as military sexual trauma, the impact of service on women, that's the approach I'm going to come at this as, we know that the needs are not necessarily the same. So how are you defining occupational versus operational stress injuries? And how do you see us getting some standardization in actually thinking about these intersections that make up veterans now in terms of treatment guidelines?
Thank you for raising that. That's a very important topic, and the approach with regards to how we would view occupational regard and also comparing it to operational. So occupational injuries or occupational stress is often used outside of the military or veteran kind of context, and operational kind of stress injuries has evolved more as a Canadian term that was established by former Lieutenant Colonel Grenier, primarily to destigmatize mental illness, that individuals could be deployed on operation and instead of coming back with a physical injury could have a stress injury. For kind of most clinicians within the network, kind of the veteran health is, we would view military sexual trauma as an operational stress injury as opposed to specifically occupational. But when we describe it probably to most people, it's a work-related kind of injury, would be the same on kind of on the civilian side.
So as a follow-on for that, as we're looking at sex and gender as an intersection in terms of the research that's being done in the realm of post-traumatic stress disorder, break it down, moral injury, knowing you have a very strong research background, how are you including sex and gender in terms of how you follow on with your research? Because the women population is growing.
Yeah, that's a very critical question, and also now with if you're applying for grants, that question you need to answer that. So in the past, for example, work that even I had published, there are less women in military or in the veteran population. So if you did not have you might not have a large enough sample size of women, so often they were excluded from the studies. That would be something that would have occurred in the past, meaning the numbers were too small. You could not, if you started doing research, you'd risk identifying individuals because Canada's small, and if you talk about where they're deployed, and also the numbers for statistical power were too small. However, now to get something published, and it's forcing a lot of researchers that you can't exclude somebody because of that. You need to actually, when you're doing studies, you need to oversample individuals where the numbers would be smaller, meaning you make sure that you have more, you do all that you can do in the research study to recruit more women so that you have sufficient number so that you do not exclude them. So that would be an area now that would be consistent in research, is that. So that would be one area that's a major advance. And then we also need to ensure that when we're asking questions that we have women or looking at that whole area to say, does this question, is it meaningful to you? Because the question itself might be different. So we don't want to make assumptions of old questions or studies that might not have looked at that to that degree. So first is asking and getting, kind of ensuring that you're sampling, and then making sure that you're not making interpretations based on very, very small numbers.
Okay,